As we start this journey together, we just want to be mindful of the fact that the Bible is made up of a series of individual books. But those books are part of a redemptive narrative. There's one redemptive narrative from Genesis all the way through to Malachi in the Old Testament, and then it moves all the way through to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. So one redemptive narrative with Jesus at the center. What do we mean by Jesus at the center? Jesus is at the center because as we go through the story of the Old Testament, what you're going to find when we come to the end of the Old Testament is that it is an unfinished story. There's no king on the throne, the king who had been promised to King David. There's no new covenant. There's no full restoration of all the things that the prophets had promised. And in fact, it reminds us that the Old Testament is an unfinished story because Jesus is the fulfillment of the story. So each week, we're going to look at a couple of New Testament passages that give us some insight into how Jesus is the fulfillment of this redemptive narrative. And we even start that when we look at Genesis 1 and 2, we think of his role in creation. When we look at Genesis chapter 3, we're going to look at Romans chapter 5 because Jesus is the second Adam. So this is going to help you put together the Bible theologically as well. And therefore, when we read individual passages, we want to try and see how it fits within the larger redemptive narrative. And that's exactly why the timeline is going to help you. We also have a New Testament Bible study series which continues. These two Bible studies stand alone. You can just do the Old Testament or you can just do the New Testament. But if you do them both together, this will enable you to trace the redemptive story from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. Well, let me share with you about the acronym Casket Empty. If you have your timeline in front of you, it would be helpful for you to look at the timeline because it is going to, you're going to become very familiar with this to begin with, but it's going to help you to trace the redemptive story of the entire Bible. So first of all, the acronym Casket represents the Old Testament and the acronym Empty represents the New Testament. The word casket empty together points to Jesus's death and resurrection as the center of the biblical narrative. And so death begins with Adam in Genesis chapter 3, but life beyond the grave is going to come through Jesus and his empty tomb. Casket Empty helps you put the whole story together. Well, I'm going to introduce you to the acronym Casket since we're looking at the Old Testament. And then when you do the New Testament, you'll be introduced to the acronym Empty. C, first letter, C stands for creation. I want you to notice on your timeline that there is a picture of two trees for the period of creation. The two trees represent the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When we come to our study in Genesis chapter 3, we're going to spend some time looking at the two trees and why they're so important. Because in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, God gives a command to Adam and he says you can eat from any tree of the garden except from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve disobey God's command, and that is going to change the shape of the whole human story from Genesis chapter 3 onward. So C stands for creation. A stands for Abraham, and this covers the period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jacob's descendants, and it takes us all the way through to the period of Sinai, which is the next one. Notice on the chart that the picture for Abraham is a gift. Well, why do we have a gift? The gift represents God's grace to Abraham. And this is seen in two particular areas, but throughout the whole narrative. When God calls Abraham out of Ur in Genesis chapter 11, verse 27, and we see the call in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. When God calls Abraham out of Ur, he's not calling a good man and he's not calling a righteous man, because in fact, Abraham's family worship idols. And this is God's grace that is coming to Abraham. When God initiates a relationship with Abraham, it is because of his grace, and the picture of a gift represents God's grace. You're also going to see on the timeline that the gift is also next to a promise that is being made in Genesis chapter 15, and in particular Genesis chapter 15 verse 6. Because there we find that Abraham believes in God, and we are told that Abraham not only believes, he trusts in God, but God reckons his faith as righteousness. Now that sounds rather technical, but we're going to learn about what that means and why that verse is so important for the whole Bible. But at this point, I just want you to notice that the gift represents God's grace in the call of Abraham, and also in his what we call justification, Genesis 15 verse 6. So we have creation, Abraham, now we're coming to Sinai. Sinai is the period covering the exodus from Egypt. They're going to arrive in a place called Mount Sinai, and this covers the books of Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. So this takes us from the period of the Exodus all the way through until entrance into the land before we get to the next time period. The picture for Sinai is the Ten Commandments. This underscores that God makes commands. This is called the Mosaic Covenant. We'll be looking at that covenant. And this is really the period of Moses, who is the central leader. And this is when the laws are given concerning the covenant in this time period. Next time period we come to, so we've had creation, Abraham, Sinai. Next time period is Kings. Kings begins with Saul and then David and Solomon. I want you to notice that the picture for Kings is a blue crown. The blue crown represents the royal line of Judah. The period of Kings is going to begin with 1050 BC, and it's going to take us all the way through to 586. The next time period is exile. You'll notice on the timeline that you have a picture of a vulture. The vulture represents the curses of the Mosaic Covenant. We will learn about the curses of the covenant way back in the time of Sinai, because you'll find a picture of a vulture at that time period as well. So this is when the Israelites go into exile into Babylon. And then the last letter, T, stands for temple, and this is the time when the Israelites go back into Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This is a wonderful time, and yet it is also a time where they are under the rule of the Persian Empire. So God has begun to restore his people, and you'll see the picture for temple is a picture of a temple. This is what we call the second temple, because the first temple was actually made during the time of Solomon. And yet the Israelites rebuild the temple at this time. You'll also see on the picture that there is no glory cloud on the temple. This is because there is no sign of God's glory filling it, as we saw during the time of the first temple. This last time period is therefore when they go back into Jerusalem, they return, there's rebuilding, there's covenant renewal, and this takes us to the end of the Old Testament, to approximately 430 or 400 BC. So I would encourage you, as you begin your study of the Old Testament, to memorize the acronym Casket. I would encourage you to memorize the picture and be aware of what the picture is. The study guide gives you a lengthy explanation for each one. And I would even encourage you to memorize the dates for each time period, because the dates will help you put the biblical books in their right context. Each week, you'll be asked to read 4 or 5 chapters from the Bible, usually 4 from the Old Testament, and then some selected readings from the New Testament. Because every time we do our study, we not only want to look at the Old Testament, but we want to see how how it is being fulfilled in the whole canon itself. And so we also trace key passages in the New Testament while we're looking at the Old Testament. So that happens throughout the study. I'm also working with John Moser, who has been a pastor for many years, and he's written some very helpful questions for discussion in your small groups and as you study the Bible together. He's written some helpful questions, not only to help you learn the content, but also as you think about how does God's word apply to us today. So as we go through this journey together, there are certain things that you're going to need to help you. The first thing, of course, is a Bible. And we would encourage you to use a hard copy Bible. It's certainly possible to read the Bible on phones, and that's helpful at times. But really, having your own Bible helps you to own the material and to underline. We encourage you to underline key Bible verses along the way, to write in the margins, so that this really becomes your workbook as well. And then there are some other resources for you that are going to help you. And really the most important one is the Old Testament timeline. And what this timeline is it opens up, and as you go through each one of the studies, I'm going to be encouraging you to look at the timeline before you move on to the next study. And so these Bible study videos will also help you to locate the individual books within the timeline. The other resource that you're going to need is the Casket empty maps. And the maps, basically, we have 7 maps of the Old Testament. And these maps will help you trace the redemptive story, but the geography of where events take place. For example, when we're in the book of Exodus, we'll see that the Israelites are in Egypt, and yet they moved to Mount Sinai. That means that the map on the Exodus from Egypt is going to trace those movements for you. So as you're reading some of the key chapters, you want to also have the map open in front of you, as this will help you visualize where we are within the redemptive story. Another example is the Israelites are going to go to Babylon during the time of the exile. And so you want to look at the Babylonian Empire, and you want to see where they go to, where Ezekiel lives, and where Daniel is brought as well. That's another place where we see the maps. The maps help us then to trace the story, but the geographical movement of it as well. And then the last thing to mention is we have a Casket Empty Study Guide. Basically, each week you'll be asked to read the study guide. You don't have to read it. It's not required because there are not questions on the study guide. But we will be giving you key pages to read, which will help you dig deeper into that particular time period. There is also the bookmark that gives you some additional Bible readings as well. Well, we're delighted that you have embarked on this journey through the Old Testament. And our prayer is that you would deepen in your love of who God is, you would deepen in your knowledge of the Scriptures, and you would begin to see the wonderful richness of this redemptive plan that is fulfilled with Jesus at the center.